17 priests entered this house of God and were never seen again. The last one wrote a letter, not a farewell, but a warning. The ink was smeared with something darker than water, and it ended mid-sentence. They are not who they claim to be. This isn't a story. This is a suppressed chapter of American histories, buried, sealed in Vatican vaults for over a century. Between 1847 and 1862, at Sacred Heart Seminary in the cold heart of Illinois, 17 young priests vanished without a trace. Church called them transfers, promotions, retreats, but that's not what the hidden letters say. It's not. What the floorboards whispered when investigators pulled out the blood-stained robes. The 3 men who ran the seminary weren't priests. They were imposters, criminals from Ireland who had slit the throats of the real clergy and stepped into their robes. For 15 years, they operated a human trafficking network from inside the walls of a religious institution. Imagine that. A school built to train holy men becoming a front for something ancient and unholy. But here's what they don't want you to know. Sacred Heart was never just a seminary. It was a funnel, mechanism for identifying, isolating, and extracting young men, boys who could be molded, broken, sold. And once they were taken, the church didn't ask questions, because they knew, because the structure was never sacred. It was systemic. And this system didn't begin in Illinois. It began in Rome, in corridors lit with incense and deception, in secret orders whispered beneath Latin prayers. Ask yourself, how could 17 disappear from a single building in just 15 years? Without someone allowing it? The truth is simple. Evil doesn't hide in shadows. It hides in symbols, in robes, in rituals, in smiles that speak of salvation while hands perform damnation. And if you think this story is rare, you're already lost. This is your first descent. But by the 10th, you won't see the world the same way again. That's a promise. Because the real faith, the one they taught you to kneel before, was never built to save you, was built to control you. Now, step forward. Take the next breath. The descent has begun. The architects of the trap, false priests, and the system they served, they came draped in authority, 3 men with thick Irish accents. Letters of recommendation and stories carved from prestige. Father Edmund Walsh, Rector Thomas Murphy, and Dean Patrick O'Brien. To the faithful, they looked like saviors, learned God-fearing, brilliant. But the church never verified their credentials. No real investigation, no paper trail, just a silent acceptance from the hierarchy, because these men weren't anomalies. They were instruments. And Sacred Heart was the perfect place to test something darker. You must understand this. Institutions don't collapse from rot. They evolve through it. These imposters weren't hiding. They were operating with autonomy. The Bishop of Chicago handed them control with blind trust, perhaps something closer to complicity. They built the seminary like a fortress, miles from the nearest city, thick walls, narrow halls, doors that locked from the outside, a design not for learning but for containment. Inside, a curriculum so demanding it blurred the line between devotion and exhaustion. Latin recitations before sunrise, silence at meals, only 1 letter home per month. No visitors, no laughter, no freedom. And every move, watched, logged, judged. Discipline was the weapon. Obedience was God. Doubt was sin. And in that atmosphere of suffocation, the boys began to fold. But the selection wasn't random. The priests handpicked each student. They chose those with wealth, strength, and no strong community ties. Boys who wouldn't be missed too loudly. Boys whose families were too devout, too distant to ask the wrong questions. They called it a seminary, but it was a processing center, supply chain. These boys were being groomed out for the cloth, but for commerce. And here's the truth no one dares speak. The church has always understood the power of masks. Robe, the rosary, the sacred oath. They disarmed suspicion. They neutralized the mind. And once trust is blind, Anything can be done in the name of salvation. When Michael Brennan vanished, they crafted a story, heroic, tragic, holy, but he never left. He never reached Iowa. His boots were still under his bed, his rosary still. On the table, in the floorboards beneath Father Walsh's office, they creaked, they wept, because something had been buried there. What you'd been told was piety, was a marketplace. What you believed was divine, was operational. The seminary was a stage, it's the clergy, its actors, the students, its currency. Still, this is only the second veil. You haven't seen what's beneath the crypt. The disappearance ritual, when faith becomes a cage, the first disappearance was masked with a miracle. Michael Brennan, the promising student with a mind for canon law and a heart for God, was declared a martyr in training, called away in the dead of night to minister to cholera victims across the frozen plains of Iowa. They said he left without time to gather his coat, his boots, or his grandmother's rosary, without saying goodbye to his closest friend, without food, without a horse, in minus 15 degrees. That lie was so absurd, so poorly constructed, that only fear could make it believable. But that's the genius of institutional power. It doesn't require truth. It only requires structure, rank, ritual, robes, the illusion of order. And the church has perfected that illusion for nearly 2,000 years. Michael's roommate, Joseph Kennedy, asked questions. Just two. Where was Michael's coat? Oh, why? Was his rosary still here? And for that, he was sentenced to a week in isolation. In a stone chapel beneath the seminary, lit by a single flickering candle, a room where sound didn't travel and where prayers didn't echo back. They called it a place of reflection. But every student knew what it really was, a place to break you. From that day forward, Joseph stopped asking questions, as did the others. They saw what happened when you noticed too much, when you remembered too well, when you cared too deeply, and then one by one, they began to vanish. A boy sent to Milwaukee, another transferred to a mission near the Missouri River, a third called away to care for dying settlers in Kansas. Always alone, always at night, always with no witnesses. No letters came from these missions. No parish records showed them arriving. And when families wrote, their letters were returned stamped with a red wax seal and a sentence that still sends chills. Return to the Father's care. And inside the seminary, the disappearances were never discussed. Not by students, not by staff. Silence became scripture. Because here's the truth. It wasn't just the false priests running this. It was the silence of the good, the fear of the righteous, and the power of a lie spoken from the pulpit. This wasn't just crime, it was liturgy, like the systematic conversion of human souls into currency. The seminary trained them to obey. Then it disappeared them in the church above. It kept sending money. Sanctified silence. How institutions manufacture amnesia by the winter of 1850, for students were gone. No bodies, no graves, no investigations. Just stories wrapped in scripture and sealed behind the altar. But the church didn't panic. It promoted, it expanded. It praised Sacred Heart for producing men of extraordinary discipline and divine zeal. Bishops visited, donors wrote checks. And Rome looked the other way. Why? Because institutions don't fear sin, they fear exposure. And Sacred Heart Seminary was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Produce loyal men, whether to pulpits or to ports, whether to confessionals or cargo ships. This is the hidden history of power. Collar isn't just a symbol of holiness, it's a license, a uniform, a way to enter places unchallenged, ask questions unopposed, move bodies unseen. And once the seminary proved it could supply such men obedient, silenced, shaped, it became more valuable than ever. Whispers of what happened inside began surfacing in Millfield, the small town 5 miles down the road. Farmers claimed to have seen covered wagons leaving the seminary long after midnight, escorted by torchlight. One claimed he found a silver crucifix in the snow, stained with something that wasn't rust. But when he brought it to the local priest, he was told to repent for bearing false witness. So that's how institutional control works, not by force, but by inversion. It turns concern into heresy. It makes suspicion a sin. And when truth knocks on the door, it's excommunicated. One former groundskeeper, an aging man named Elias Booker, confessed on his deathbed that he'd seen the false priests dragging something heavy through the snow into the cellar. "I heard them chanting," he whispered. "Not Latin, older, wrong." He died 3 days later. Official cause, pneumonia. His wife said he'd started screaming in his sleep. Something about eyes watching from the chapel walls. In that chapel, it was never just for prayer. Students reported hearing sounds beneath the floor during Mass, scratching, moaning ones, low hum that made their teeth ache, that they were taught to ignore it, to trust, to kneel, because nothing traps the mind like sanctified authority. The more they suffered, the more they were told it was holy, the more they questioned, the more they were told it was pride. What began as a seminary had become a sanctified machine, not to teach God, but to erase those who sought him. The cellar beneath the cross, where God couldn't hear them beneath the chapel floor, behind a rusted iron grate, only accessible with a skeleton key held by Father Walsh, there was a second world, one not found in any blueprint. A cellar, cut from the bedrock, cold, silent, and soaked with secrets. It wasn't meant for storage. There were no barrels, no wine, no records. Only shackles bolted to stone. Wooden restraints polished smooth by struggling wrists. And on the far wall etched into the limestone words, not in Latin, not in English, but in something far older. The surviving correspondence hidden beneath the chapel floor revealed something even darker than trafficking. These men weren't just selling bodies, they were performing rites. Initiation through isolation, obedience through starvation, erasure through ritual. They called it the trial of the will, a test designed to purify the vessel before breaking it. Men were taken below for days at a time, starved of food, light, and human contact. When they returned, they were changed, silent, hollow-eyed, devout to a fault. But witnesses described screams that didn't sound human, echoing up from the floorboards during morning mass. And one night, March 3rd, 1853, those screams turned into fire. Smoke rose from beneath the seminary, filling the chapel with the scent of scorched meat and burning hair. But the fire never reached the upper floors. It stopped almost intentionally at the cellar's edge. The next morning, Father Murphy told the students that a lantern had fallen during maintenance. No one was hurt, no need to worry. But no one saw Michael Whelan again. The same pattern always, isolation, ritual, erasure. These weren't just disappearances, they were sacrifices. And the Vatican, they knew. Letters from Bishop Corder to Rome show that questions were raised, then silenced. We are managing the matter internally. For the stability of the faithful, discretion is imperative. Translation: bury it. Yeah. But you can't bury everything, not when the land itself remembers. Locals who hiked near the old ruins decades later reported hearing whispers in the wind, footsteps in the grass, a bell tolling at midnight when no bell remained. And now, halfway through this descent, I ask you to declare yourself right here in the comments. Type the phrase, "the eyes beneath the altar" twice. It's not just for the algorithm, for the transformation. It's to mark the point of no return. Because what comes next is the unveiling. The mask of holiness. How evil hides in plain sight they wore. Cossacks whispered prayers in Latin and touched their fingers to the sign of the cross. But beneath those holy robes, there were no shepherds. Only wolves, Father Walsh, Rector Murphy, Dean O'Brien, names that inspired respect, fear, and blind obedience. Men praised for their theological brilliance, their moral clarity, their sacred bearing. But here's what you were never told. None of them existed. Not on any Irish church registry. Not in any European seminary. Not in death records. The men running Sacred Heart were ghosts. It wasn't until 1879, nearly 2 decades after the seminary was abandoned, that a traveling Jesuit historian traced inconsistencies in church documents back to Illinois. He cross-referenced signatures, handwriting, even ink composition. What he found was damning. The same man had signed all 3 priestly recommendations, with 3 different names: forgery, identity theft, and something worse. Because the real Father Edmund Walsh, the original one, had boarded a ship in Dublin in 1846 and was never seen again. His name struck from passenger manifests, his belongings found in a dockyard alley soaked in blood. So who stood in his place at Sacred Heart? It's the question that should shake you. Who had the power, the poise, the linguistic genius to impersonate not just 1, but 3 high-ranking scholars of the church for 15 years? Who had the connections to falsify letters from bishops, to deceive the Diocese of Chicago, to move money, men, and flesh? Without detection, no ordinary con man, no lunatic. This was orchestrated, backed, protected. Some believe they were part of an older order, one not aligned with Rome but buried beneath it. Secret fraternity of rogue theologians who believed obedience was slavery, and power was divinity. They believed in ritual, but not salvation, in control, not communion. These men weren't atheists. They were something worse. They believed in God, hated Him. They used Scripture not as a path to light, but as a shroud for shadow, and Sacred Heart became their temple, their experiment, their altar. The students weren't just victims. They were proof that, with the right symbols, the right hierarchy, and the right silence, you can make anyone kneel. That's the real horror, not the vanished priests, but the obedience that made their vanishing possible. We are not studying history here. We are excavating a system. The book Beneath the Altar, Doctrine Written in Blood in 1904. During a failed renovation of the abandoned Sacred Heart Seminary, a crew of masons broke open the foundation beneath the main altar. They expected to find cracked stone, maybe a crawl space. What they uncovered was a book, leather-bound, human hide. Its pages soaked through with mildew and something blacker, contained no gospel, no psalms, only diagrams, names, and symbols. Some traced back to Babylon, others never seen before. This was no Bible, this was a ledger. 17 names, ages, backgrounds, family estates, physical strength assessments, educational levels. Notes like ideal candidate for overseas transport, compliant after second isolation, to inquisitive remove. The final page bore no words, only an etching of a chalice with a tongue inside. It was handed off to the Diocese of Joliet. Disappeared within the week. But not before a photograph was taken. And not before one terrified clerk who had handled it barehanded cut off 3 of his own fingers and checked himself into a sanitarium. His final words before institutionalization. The prayers were backwards. They called something up. Because what you must now understand is, this Sacred Heart was not just a trafficking hub. It was a ritual site. Not ritual like Mass, ritual like invocation. Every disappearance aligned with something. A lunar cycle, a feast day, a blood moon. The liturgical calendar had been inverted, twisted into a map of sacrifice and control. The students, they were offerings, not just to buyers, but to something else. You think this is madness? But the oldest religions pre-Christian, pre-Gudicalis, demanded blood and silence. Sacred Heart masked the old ways investments in Latin, and the church let it happen, because what the church fears most is not sin. It is disorder. There are always forces deeper than doctrine. When bishops turn blind eyes and the Vatican locks documents for 150 years, it's not because they're clueless, it's because they're complicit. That book Beneath the Altar was never meant to be found. It was buried beneath 4 tons of sacred marble. But even stone cannot silence the screams of the damned. Now you know what was written in blood. Behind. Stained glass beneath the cross. The question is, will you forget it or remember what you were never meant to see? The witness who spoke once, then vanished forever in 1929. A man named Elias Granger walked into the Joliet City Police Station. Wearing a mud-caked priest's cassock and carrying a rusted tin box, he was pale, hunched, barely able to speak. He hadn't been on any missing persons list, and no church in Illinois claimed him. But what he told investigators was recorded in 6 trembling pages before he was transferred to St. Dymphna's Asylum and never seen again. He claimed to be a survivor of Sacred Heart Seminary, not a student, not a priest, a servant. At age 14, Elias said he was taken from a nearby orphanage to clean the halls, haul coal, and keep quiet. He said the priests called him Mouse. He was told to stay in the servants' quarters, forbidden to speak to the boys. But he watched, and he remembered. According to Granger, there were never more than 33 students at a time. No one ever graduated. No one ever wrote home. He said students disappeared during storms and were replaced by new ones the following week. No one asked questions. No one dared. And on the night of December 12, 1857, Elias said he saw something that broke his mind forever. Through a cracked wooden door in the subcellar, he witnessed a gathering of 7 men, all robed in crimson vestments, chanting in reverse Latin around a boy tied naked to a stone table. One of the men, taller than the rest, wearing a golden crown of thorns, raised a knife carved from animal bone. The boy never screamed. His mouth was sewn shut. What Elias remembered most wasn't the killing. It was what came after. The walls began to hum. The candles flared black. And in the center of the stone floor beneath the body, something opened. Elias fled, hid for days. When he emerged, the seminary was empty. Door swinging, candles still burning, no priests, no students, only blood in the cracks of the floor. The tin box he carried. It held one thing, the blood-soaked ribbon of the boy's sewn mouth. Police took the statement, filed it under delirium. The box vanished. Elias was institutionalized. 2 days later, he slit his own throat with a shard of mirror. But the janitor who cleaned the blood from his room quit that night. His only explanation. There were hoof prints on the ceiling. The Vatican visit and the man in the iron crucifix in 1933. Amidst rising rumors of occult ties and defunct American dioceses, the Vatican quietly dispatched one man to Illinois. Archbishop Lucian Rinaldi is a Jesuit, fluent in 13 languages. Known inside Rome as the Cleaner. His role was not pastoral. It was containment. He arrived under the guise of inspecting rural church properties for restoration. His carriage stopped only once at the ruins of Sacred Heart Seminary. Witnesses say he entered with 2 assistants and a leather case. No one saw him again for 3 days. What happened inside during those 72 hours has been buried under layers of silence. But a letter, misfiled and later leaked in 1974, offered a glimpse. It was addressed to His Eminence, Secretary of State, and marked eyes only, Rinaldi wrote. The structure beneath the main sanctuary is not of Christian origin. The walls are not stone, but some calcified compound unknown to our engineers. Symbols predating Abraham have been carved not with tools but with heat, some type of searing script. The residue is not soot. It is ash, human. And then came the line that burned into the memory of every Vatican translator who touched the page. I found the crucifix. Not a symbol. A man, still alive. Or something like alive. Chained to a bronze cross, body stretched and pierced with 36 iron nails, tongue removed, eyes sewn shut. The iron had fused to his rib cage. His skin was parchment. His breath came once every few minutes, like wind through a hollow tomb. Rinaldi claimed the entity spoke not aloud, but in the minds of all 3 who saw him, it whispered in perfect Latin, I was the first and the last. And they crowned me with silence. The Archbishop sealed the chamber, called for Vatican black robes officials so hidden they don't wear vestments, just plain suits. No record of them exists. But neighbors say a train with no markings arrived at 3:14 a.m. on a moonless night, and when it left, so did Sacred Heart. The ruins were demolished. The stones shipped in sealed crates, the foundations salted, but the land remains cold. Animals avoid it. Birds don't nest there. Every few decades, someone reports hearing a chant under the soil. A chant in perfect Latin, reversed. You were never meant to know the final cover-up of Sacred Heart. By 1957, Sacred Heart Seminary was erased from maps, from parish archives, from public memory. Not condemned, disappeared. Like it never stood. But the land remained, fenced off by the diocese, and listed only as private church holdings. No graves were ever found, no records of where the students were buried, no list of names, no lawsuits, no survivors. But something happened in 1986 that changed everything. Real estate developer Mark Elgin bought up land in Will County. Not knowing that one parcel contained the former site of Sacred Heart, he planned to build a subdivision. Laid out streets, sewer lines, even named it Seraphim Heights. The first bulldozer hit something beneath the soil. Not stone, not bone. A bell. It rang loud, deep, and no one could explain how it rang when it was cracked clean in half. That night, Mark Elgin's wife was found wandering Route 6, barefoot and covered in mud, whispering a child's prayer backward. Their daughter vanished. From her bed, no sign of forced entry. Only ash on the windowsill. Elgin withdrew the development. The land was quietly bought back by an anonymous trust affiliated with the Archdiocese of Chicago. Today it is covered in tall grass. No fence. No sign. Just a rusted plaque buried in the soil that reads, Sanctificetur Nomen Tuum. Hallowed be thy name. But it isn't God's name they hallowed here. Every attempt to uncover the past has met ruin. The one journalist who pursued the story in the 90s died of a brain aneurysm hours before publishing. His files were stolen. From his office, his hard drive melted. Literally. When FOIA requests were filed to uncover old diocesan transfers. One name kept coming up, Father Matthias Creel, assigned to Sacred Heart in 1851. Never reassigned, never buried, just ongoing. Mission. To this day, the Vatican has never acknowledged Sacred Heart existed. But if you trace the architecture of certain churches built in its wake, you'll notice something. The stained glass patterns repeat. The altar design recurs. And always, always, a red-painted door somewhere in the sanctuary is sealed shut. If you ever see it, don't open it, don't ask, don't pray, just leave. Because Sacred Heart was never closed. It was buried. Ain't what is buried.